At this point, I think everyone out there knows about the Seagull ST19 based chronographs. Whether it's from the Seagull 1963, one of the various homages out there, or from one of the few micro brands to adopt it, these days they're a lot more common. And with good reason. They're basically the only affordable option out there if you want to make a mechanical chronograph. So it's no surprise that when Vesuviate decided to make their own new chronograph, they also went with a Seagull movement. Except this one has a bit of a trick up its sleeve. You see, it's actually an automatic, not a straight mechanical. It's using the ST1940, an automatic version of Seagull's ST1901 movements. And the crazy thing is that this movement isn't new. It's actually been around for a while now, which surprised me because not many people have heard of it, let alone used it. Now, since the movement here is by far the most interesting part of the Attivo chronograph, we might as well just get that out of the way. First off, let's just take a moment and admire how beautiful this one is. Seriously, just take it in and I'll put up some mood music. And this is one that I really appreciate they went with a skeletonized rotor, just so you can actually see more of it. When it comes to movements, I'm not an expert, so I only know some of the basics here. Well, that and Seagull announced it about 10 years ago, and I do believe that this is based on their ST19 movements, which in turn are also based on the older Swiss Venus 175s. So in terms of pros and cons, there's going to be two major pros here. First off, we've already talked about it, it's a good looking movement. And two, just like its mechanical counterpart, there isn't anything else like it in this price range. So if you want to buy or want to make an affordable automatic chronograph, this is pretty much your only option. As for the cons, well, the obvious one here is that movement is a bit of an unknown. There just isn't much of a track record on it. And I'm not sure if this is really going to translate over the screen, but there is quite a bit of depth here. It's a thick one. I've also heard it mentioned that with the ST1901s, they're pretty hard to get serviced. I'm not sure how true that is, since they are based on an older, more well-known movement. But if it is true, then that's going to be even more so with this one. Now, Vesuviate is including a 1-year warranty, but after that, who knows what to expect. It could run for a decade or more with no problems, but we just don't know that right now. Although Vesuviate has done a couple of really cool things to help alleviate some of those concerns. You see, they actually got prototypes of these about 1.5 years ago, and they've been running the entire time. If they weren't being worn by the brand owner, he had them sitting on a winder. That, and more recently, Vesuviate has hired a senior watchmaker, who's going to go over each watch as well as further regulate the movements before they ever ship out. So they know that there's some questions here, and it's good to see that they're doing what they can and getting ahead of it. And before we get any further, I do need to point out that this watch was provided by Vesuviate, and I don't need to send it back, hence the promotional tag. As well as Vesuviate's doing a really interesting take on the whole Kickstarter thing. In this situation, I'm normally looking at a pretty early prototype, and production won't be complete for about 1 year or more. Whereas here, this is a full production unit. Production's completely done. Yet for some reason, Vesuviate still wants to launch this on Kickstarter with a short 2-week campaign, before being directly sold on their site. It's a pretty unusual strategy, and I'm honestly not sure why. But it is good news for those that don't like to wait, because these are ready to go. That said, let's start talking specs, and then we'll get to the design. This one is 39mm wide and has a lug-to-lug of 46.2. And if you can't tell just by looking at it, it is a bit of a chunky monkey at 14.4mm. But to be fair here, most automatic chronographs are a bit thick. For instance, I believe the Tag Monaco is about 14.3mm, and my Hamilton Intramatic is 14.5. So it's still a big boy, but it's not abnormal for what it is. Just think of automatic chronographs as the fat cam for watches. You're also looking at 100 meters of water resistance with a signed screw-down crown, a sapphire crystal with a very shallow curvature to it, and the case and bracelet are hardened with an extra scratch-resistant coating, which is always great to see, and I wish more brands would do it. And especially here with this bracelet, as it's very polished and sort of integrated into the watch. Sort of. We'll get to that. Now remember, this is a square watch. Not that I really need to remind you of it, but I do need to remind you that square watches do wear a little bit differently. It's going to wear larger, and it's kind of hard to judge them until you really get them on your wrist. And for me, with my 7.25-inch wrist, I think it wears somewhere closer to a 42, maybe 43 millimeter. And overall, it is pretty comfortable on my wrist. However, one thing that really bugs me here is just how high this thing rides. If you look at it from the side, the bracelet hits right about the midline of the case. And then you also have this giant case back pushing everything up even further. And at 175 grams, give or take a link or two, this one winds up riding pretty high and winds up being a little top heavy. Even on its bracelet, possibly more if you ever get this on a strap. If you're looking at this and thinking it looks familiar, there's a good reason for it. As Vesuviate's first watch, the regular Attivo came out a couple years ago. And if I'm being perfectly honest here, when I reviewed the original Attivo, it didn't really remind me of anything. It was just a very unusual square design. However, throw a chronograph into the design and a light bulb suddenly goes off. And I see what you did here, as there's now an obvious similarity to a Tag Monaco. Even the dimensions are similar. But at the same time, I wouldn't call this an homage, as it does have a style of its own. One with this really unusual case shape, one that flares out at the corners and is topped off with this very polished bezel. In fact, there are polished bits everywhere on this one, including the end links that feed into the center link of the bracelet, giving the Attivo a pretty striking look. One that I think is more of a casual sports watch than, say, a tool watch. There's just far too much polish here for me to think of this as a tool watch. And speaking of polish, as you can see in some of these shots, that polish also leads to this one being quite a fingerprint magnet. It's nice that the case and the bracelet are hardened, so you don't really need to worry about scratches, but there's no getting around those fingerprints. Over at the right, the screw down crown is pretty easy to get hold of and use, while the pushers on either side are fantastic, nice and responsive, just as a mechanical chronograph should be. That's why people obsess over them. And one thing I really love here is the crystal. With some watch designs, the distortion of the crystal becomes a distraction and tends to block out some of that design. Whereas others, like this one, the crystal helps to magnify and enhance almost every aspect of the dial, making it a watch you just can't help but stare at. Although the downside with this crystal is that it also has some occasional glare issues. Nothing too bad, but it is something you're going to notice as you take in the dial. Moving on to the dial, and with this one there is going to be a total of 6 different colorways, some of which are much more vibrant than others. But this one, the maroon brown version, has this darker, almost dull flat reddish brown dial, which I gotta say is quite a contrast from the flashiness of the case, as well as the previous regular 3-handed Attivo. It looks good and helps with the readability, it's just not what I was expecting. Otherwise, the design here does follow that of the regular Attivo, where you have applied bars for indices forming a circle with painted minute markers in between. It's just that here you also have the addition of the sunken subdials, which fits the design perfectly. Not only does it give it a little bit of a Monaco look, but I think it's actually an improvement over the original version. The original version felt too empty to me. With its squarish shape, there's a lot of unused space on that dial. Where with this one and its no-date design, it feels more symmetrical and balanced. Overall, just a good-looking and easy-to-use design. One I think a lot of people could enjoy, if they could get over their OCD of the empty corners. But that's just how square watches roll. As for the bracelet, well, just like with the original, I got mixed feelings on this one. For the most part, it's an excellent, well-made bracelet. You have good-looking, solid links. Love it or hate it, you got a butterfly clasp, as well as solid quick-release end links. So, other than the back edges of the bracelet feeling a tad sharp, I'd say it's well made. And my issues here more stem from the design, and a lot of that is just because I'm used to wearing thinner bracelets with more taper. You see, this one flares out to 24 millimeters before then tapering down to 22, and that's pretty wide, at least compared to what I'm used to. And in some ways, kinda crazy to think about a 24mm bracelet on a 39mm watch. But again, wider bracelets are just how square watches roll. The other thing here is that while it does have quick release end links, the bars on those end links are so recessed that it's pretty hard to get access to them without some sort of tool. I've tried multiple times with just my fingers and I can't get them off. it just kind of defeats the whole purpose of it. Sort of. The thing is, just like the original Attivo, the chronograph here uses a 16mm lug width. That's right, I said 16, which is a bit unusual. So while it's not technically an integrated bracelet or a proprietary system, because of that 16mm width, you're going to have a hard time finding any other strap to use with this one. So while the addition of the quick release mechanism is nice, there's not much point in taking this one off anyways. Now, with regard to price and value, pay attention here because I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you. With this one, the retail is $475, but the Kickstarter will be $425, with some even further discounts for the first 100 baht, those of which are probably already gone. After that, they're going to sell directly on their site for retail, but there's also a 7% off code that brings it down to $442. Confused yet? Either way, estimating value here is also going to be a bit tricky. Because what do you really compare this to? What's the baseline? I only know of one other watch with this ST1940 movement, and that one came out 10 years ago. Now, if you compare this to the Seagull mechanicals, the straight mechanicals, these are obviously going to be a bit higher. And they probably should, as it is a little bit more of a complicated movement. Whereas if you compare this to other automatic chronographs, it's going to be half as much or even less, and especially if you're looking at the Monaco. Which on one hand is great, but it's still not really an apples to apples comparison, as you're looking at completely different movements and potentially levels of quality. So at least for right now, the Attivo Chronograph's in a world of its own. Bottom line, this is a well-made and very unusual chronograph. This watch is all about that larger-than-life square design, which is then paired with an affordable automatic chronograph movement, creating a watch that, at least in this price range, is pretty unusual. It's a great choice for someone that wants something a bit different, or for someone that's really obsessed with getting an affordable Monaco alternative without going all homage-y. However, with this one, you need to remember that while that movement is one of the watch's key strengths and what makes it really interesting, it's that movement that also comes with a ton of questions. Now, Vesuviate has gone to great lengths to show its viability, but even then, there may be some surprises in the long run. Or maybe not. That's the whole question thing. And that's just something you need to be aware of with this one. However, for some, getting an automatic chronograph at this price would be well worth it. Now, as usual, let me know your thoughts on this watch down below. And in particular, what do you think about this movement? Other than it's just gorgeous to look at. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.